Only one cage left occupied and the human shocked everyone by choosing her. The alien market was loud, crowded, and full of strange smells. Vendors shouted in different languages, trying to sell food, weapons, and rare creatures. Metal cages lined the dusty street, but today almost all of them were empty. A recent auction had cleared the market, and most traders were packing up to leave. Only one cage was still occupied. It stood at the far end, covered partly in a dirty cloth. Shadows hid most of the figure inside, but a faint blue glow came from within. People walked past without looking. Some even stepped away as if they were afraid. Daniel, a human trader from Earth, had not come to buy anyone. He had traveled to this market only for spare ship parts. He didn't like slave markets. In fact, he avoided them whenever possible. But the shortest path to the supply shop passed right through this place. As he walked, he tried to keep his eyes forward, ignoring the stares of alien merchants. But then, from that shadowed cage, a sound reached him. It wasn't a scream or a shout. It was a whisper, a single word in perfect English. Help. Daniel froze. He turned his head slowly. Inside the cage sat a thin alien girl, her skin a pale silver with faint glowing lines running across it like veins of light. Her eyes were the source of the blue glow, and they locked directly on him. She didn't look wild or dangerous, just desperate. A tall, four-armed merchant noticed Daniel staring and grinned. Human, you want to buy? The alien said, stepping closer. This one very cheap. Nobody else want her. Very bad luck. Very dangerous. But maybe you brave. Daniel frowned. What's wrong with her? He asked. The merchant leaned in and lowered his voice. Cursed. Many owners die after taking her. No one keeps her more than a week. She brings trouble. Daniel looked back at the girl. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, chains on her wrists and ankles. The way she watched him was strange. It was not the empty stare of a beaten slave. It was almost like she was testing him. He should have walked away. It wasn't his business. He didn't even believe in curses. But the sound of her whispers stayed in his mind. Help. Against his better judgment, Daniel stepped forward. How much? He asked. The merchant blinked, clearly surprised. You want her? You serious? Daniel nodded once. I'll take her, he said, his voice firm. The market went silent for a moment. Nearby traders stopped talking. Some even laughed. A group of alien buyers muttered to each other in disbelief. No one could understand why a human would choose her. But Daniel didn't care. Something about her eyes told him she had a story worth hearing. The merchant quickly took his payment, shoving a small metal key into Daniel's hand. As Daniel unlocked the cage, the girl didn't move. She just looked at him with the same calm, intense stare. Finally, she stood and stepped forward, the chains rattling softly. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile. An old alien woman selling cloth nearby reached out and grabbed Daniel's sleeve. Her voice was urgent, almost fearful. She will destroy you, human. Send her back before it's too late. Daniel pulled away and shook his head. She's coming with me. They walked out of the market together. The girl stayed silent, her head lowered. But Daniel noticed she kept glancing around, scanning the crowd, as if expecting someone to follow once they were away from the noise. Daniel finally spoke. You speak English, he said. The girl's lips moved, but her voice was barely a whisper. Yes. They reached Daniel's small transport ship just before sunset. The desert wind was picking up, carrying dust and the smell of rain. Daniel helped her inside, guiding her to the small passenger seat. He expected her to relax now that she was free, but instead, she kept looking at the door and windows, like she was afraid something was coming. That night, Daniel sat by the fire outside his ship, repairing one of his tools. The girl was inside, resting on the bench. At least, he thought she was resting. Then he heard the faint rattle of chains. He stood quickly and stepped inside. She was awake, standing by the door, not trying to run. Instead, she was peering into the darkness outside. Her voice was quiet, but urgent. They found us. Before Daniel could ask who, the ground trembled slightly. Far away, in the darkness beyond the camp, shapes were moving fast, tall, thin figures with glowing eyes. Getting closer, the girl stepped back toward him, her chains dragging across the floor. Her voice shook as she whispered, "You should not have chosen me." The fire outside the small camp crackled against the wind, but Daniel could feel the tension in the air. The way the girl stood at the door told him she was not simply frightened, she was expecting something. Her glowing eyes were fixed on the horizon where shadows moved unnaturally fast. He stepped closer, trying to catch a better look. But the moment he leaned forward, she whispered, almost like a warning carried on the wind, "Don't go outside." Daniel froze, his instincts screaming that she wasn't joking. The shapes in the darkness seemed to stretch and bend like smoke, then snap back into solid form. They were coming closer without making a sound. His hand reached for the blaster at his side, but she shook her head slowly. "They're not afraid of weapons," she said, her chains clinking softly with every small movement. An old memory flickered in his mind, stories told in grimy spaceport bars about creatures that hunted light and sound. But her tone carried something heavier, as if she knew these things personally. Daniel wasn't sure why, but instead of aiming his weapon, he stepped back and locked the ship door. The girl moved away from the window, yet still faced it, like a soldier guarding a battlefield only she could see. Outside, the shadows stopped. Daniel could feel them watching, a pressure in the air, like the weight before a storm. He wanted to ask her what they were, but something told him to wait. Then, without warning, she pressed both her chained hands together and closed her eyes. Faint blue light began to glow from her skin, lines across her arms, pulsing like veins of fire. Daniel felt the temperature drop sharply, his breath turning to mist. The shapes outside twitched, recoiling from the glow, and then just as quickly, they melted back into the dark, disappearing without a trace. The girl exhaled, the light fading from her skin until only her eyes still glowed. She looked at him, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Now they know you have me." Daniel's heart pounded, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to ask. "Who were they?" he said finally. The girl tilted her head, studying him as if deciding how much truth he deserved. "Hunters," she said. "They will follow us across worlds. They will not stop. And now, you are part of it." He didn't know whether to be angry, afraid, or just walk away, but something about the way she stood there, exhausted yet unbroken, made him realize he was already too far in. The moment he'd chosen her in that market, his life had shifted. He wasn't just a trader anymore, and whoever or whatever was after her, he had just made himself their new target. The wind outside howled, rattling the ship's hull. Daniel sat down across from her, staring into those blue eyes that seemed older than her face. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if speaking it might bring more danger. "Lyra," she said at last, and somehow, the name carried a weight he didn't understand. Not yet. Somewhere out in the desert, far beyond the dunes, a low, echoing howl rose into the night. Daniel didn't know if it was the wind or if the hunters had already begun their chase. The first howl faded into silence, but Daniel didn't relax. He sat with his blaster on the table, eyes locked on the door. The wind had shifted, no longer carrying the dry smell of sand. Now it brought something metallic, sharp, like blood. In the air, Lyra sat against the wall, her knees pulled close, her chains glinting in the dim firelight from outside. She wasn't shaking from fear, Daniel noticed. She was listening, counting the seconds between each sound. A sudden thud hit the hull, so hard the ship rocked on its landing struts. Daniel was on his feet instantly, blaster raised. A deep scraping noise followed. Something was dragging itself along the outer wall, claws on metal. He glanced at Lyra, expecting panic, but instead she shook her head, "They're testing us," she said quietly. "They like to see how prey reacts before they strike." Before Daniel could answer, a shadow crossed the window, massive and distorted. The glass fogged over for a moment, as if something breathed against it. Then, the door controls sparked. Someone or something was trying to force it open. Daniel rushed forward, but Lyra's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Don't open it. If you do, they'll come in faster than you can." Fire. The ship shuddered again, then the roof groaned under sudden weight. Dust and sand fell from the ceiling. Daniel took a step back, aiming upward. But he never got the chance to shoot, because the next sound wasn't from the roof. It was from right behind him. He spun around, and there it was. One of the hunters had slipped through a crack in the rear hatch, tall and impossibly thin, its skin dark like wet stone, its eyes burning with a cold green light. It didn't walk, it glided toward him in jerking, insect-like movements. Daniel fired without thinking. The shot hit square in the chest, but the thing barely flinched. Then, Lyra moved, faster than he'd seen her yet. She stood between him and the hunter, the glow under her skin igniting like fire through glass. The hunter hissed, its movements breaking, stumbling as if the light burned it. Another thud shook the ship. More were climbing on. "Daniel," she said without looking at him, "if I use what's inside me, they'll know exactly where we are, across the whole desert, and if you don't," he asked, already knowing the answer, "they'll take you apart before you can scream." The green-eyed hunter lunged, but Lyra's light exploded outward, filling the cabin with a blinding flash. The smell of burning metal and something foul hit Daniel's nose. The creature let out a screech that seemed to echo inside his skull, then crumbled into dust. Silence fell again, but it wasn't peace. Outside, the scratching, the breathing, all of it stopped at once, as if the hunters had decided to wait. Daniel stared at her, the afterglow still pulsing faintly along her skin. "What are you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Her eyes met his, not with pride or fear, but with a kind of sadness. "A mistake they've been hunting for years," she said, and then she closed her eyes, listening again to a night that no longer felt empty. The desert was quiet at dawn, but Daniel knew it was the kind of quiet that meant danger was hiding. The air was cold, the sand stiff from the night's chill. Lyra stood outside the ship, chains still on her wrists, scanning the horizon, like a soldier before battle. She didn't speak, she didn't have to. Daniel could feel it too. They couldn't stay here. He packed fast, grabbing only fuel cells, water, and a ration pack. Lyra never looked at what he was doing, her gaze locked on a faint shimmer in the far distance. "They're moving in a circle," she finally said. "They want to cut off every way out." Daniel checked his ship's nav map. Sure enough, 3 possible routes were already blocked by unidentified signals, and the 4th would take them straight into a canyon locals called the Bones. "Bones?" Daniel asked when she suggested it. "They won't follow us there," she said flatly. "That's good, right?" Her silence was answer enough. It wasn't good, it was worse, but it was the only way. They took off low, skimming just above the sand to avoid showing up on long-range scanners. The rising sun threw long shadows across the dunes, and for a few minutes, Daniel almost thought they'd escaped. Then the ship's sensors screamed. 3 hunter craft closing in fast from behind, moving like predators, scenting blood. Daniel pushed the thrusters, the ship rattling hard. The hunters fired nets of glowing energy that twisted in the air like living things. One clipped the wing, sending sparks through the cockpit. Lyra didn't flinch. She only said, "Keep going. If they catch me alive, everything you've ever known dies." The canyon appeared suddenly, jagged stone spires jutting into the sky like broken teeth. Daniel dove the ship between them. The hunters followed, their movements more like diving birds than machines. The walls narrowed until the wingtips were almost scraping rock. A burst of static filled the cockpit, and then a voice deep, alien, and dripping with triumph echoed from the comms. "Lyra of the light, your blood is ours. She froze at the name, the glow in her skin dimming slightly. Daniel glanced at her. You want to tell me what that means? Not yet, she said, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. They burst from the canyon into a vast hollow filled with the skeletons of colossal creatures. Bones the size of buildings littered the sand, some fused into strange shapes as if melted by impossible heat. The hunters didn't follow, instead stopping at the canyon's mouth, watching, waiting. Daniel landed near the largest rib cage for cover, shutting down the engines. Why did they stop? He asked. Because something older lives here, she answered, her voice almost a whisper. Something that even they fear. Before he could respond, the sand shifted under the ship, as if something enormous was waking beneath them. Lyra's eyes glowed faintly again, and she looked at him with a strange calm. You wanted to know why they want me? You're about to find out. The sand beneath the ship moved like water, slow at first, then faster, a deep vibration running through the ground. Daniel jumped from the cockpit, his boots sinking slightly into the shifting surface. We need to move, he said, but Lyra didn't answer. She stood perfectly still, eyes closed, the faint blue lines under her skin brightening. Something massive broke the surface, a curve of bone, blackened with age, rising higher than the ship. Daniel's first thought was that it was another skeleton, but then it moved, grinding against the air with the weight of a mountain. An eye opened within the bone, milky white, but watching. Intelligent. The air turned heavy, pressing against his chest until it was hard to breathe. Lyra's chains rattled softly as she took a step forward, and the thing lowered its massive head toward her. The glow in her skin pulsed once, and Daniel felt the pressure around them shift, like the creature recognized her. He didn't understand any of it, but he could tell this was no random meeting. Before he could ask, a crackle of static hit his come. A voice he knew. Daniel, it's Radek. You alive out there? Radek was an old contact, a smuggler who owed him more than one favor. Daniel exhaled in relief. Yeah, I've got a problem. Need a pickup? 10 minutes later, Radek's ship skimmed low over the canyon and landed beside them. He jumped out, grinning wide. Heard you've got something valuable? His eyes slid toward Lyra in a way Daniel didn't like. Daniel stepped between them. She's not for sale. Radek raised his hands, feigning innocence. Hey, I'm just here to help, get you out of this mess. But the moment Daniel turned to grab his gear, Radek's crew moved, weapons raised. They weren't here to rescue. This was a grab. Lyra didn't run. She just looked at Daniel and said quietly, Told you. No one chooses me without paying a price. Radek's men advanced, but the ground beneath them gave way. The giant bone creature's head shifted, its milky eye focusing on the newcomers. A deep, resonant sound rolled through the air. Not quite a roar, not quite speech, and the sand erupted upward, swallowing two of the men in an instant. Radek stumbled back, firing wildly. Daniel pulled Lyra behind him, the blue glow in her skin flaring brighter. If I call it, she whispered, it will protect us. But then nothing in the galaxy will. Stop following you. Daniel didn't know which was worst, the betrayal behind him or the promise in her voice. But he knew one thing. This was no longer about a choice he made in a market. It was a war he'd just stepped into. Radek's men were already scattering, shouting over each other as the sand shifted in great waves. The bone giant's head loomed above them like a pale moon, its eye glowing faintly now, not just white, but streaked with the same blue light that pulsed under Lyra's skin. Daniel's gut told him they were connected. The creature's breath, if that's what it was, washed over them in slow, heavy bursts, each exhale rattling the ship's hull. Radek fired at it, the shots vanishing into the bone as if swallowed. No scorch marks, no cracks, just nothing. Daniel, Radek shouted, give me the girl, and maybe it lets you walk away. Daniel didn't move. Lyra stepped around him, her eyes locked on the giant, her voice low, almost reverent. It's time. And before he could stop her, she held out her chained hands. the light beneath her skin blazing until it was almost too bright to look at. Her voice rose not in English, not in any language Daniel recognized, but the sound carried weight. Like ancient stone grinding against itself, the bone giant shifted, lowering its head until its forehead touched hers. The chains on her wrists turned molten and dripped away as if they'd been wax. The glow spread from her arms to her chest, to her whole body, until she was a figure of living light. Radek's men froze, their weapons trembling in their hands. Then the air cracked, not thunder, not an explosion, but something deeper, like the sound of the world itself tearing for a moment. The hunters that had been waiting at the canyon's mouth screamed, the kind of sound that pierced bone and blood. And for the first time, Daniel saw them retreat, actually retreat. The giant bone creature reared back and let out a sound that made the sky seem to ripple. Lyra turned, the glow fading slowly, but still strong enough to cast shadows across the sand. "Now they all know," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her face. Every tracker, every hunter, every ruler who wants power, they felt it. Daniel could already hear it in the distance, the low hum of approaching ships. Not hunters this time. These engines were heavier, slower, military. Radek swore under his breath, "You've just painted a target the size of a planet on all of us." Lyra looked at Daniel, not at Radek. "You chose me," she said again. "Now you choose whether we keep running, or turn and fight." And in the rising heat of the desert morning, Daniel realized there was no safe choice left. The hum of the incoming ships grew louder, a deep vibration that made the sand dance in tiny ripples. Daniel could see them now, dark shapes cutting through the pale sky, larger than hunter craft, their hulls marked with the sharp angular symbols of a war fleet. Radek was already backing toward his ship, his face pale under the desert light. "I'm not dying for either of you," he muttered. Daniel didn't stop him. His eyes were on Lyra. She stood with her hair whipping in the hot wind, the last traces of blue glow still fading under her skin. The bone giant had already sunk back into the earth, leaving only the jagged remains of its ribcage around them, like a half-built fortress. "They're not here to talk," Daniel said quietly, and Lyra's answer was just a small, knowing nod. "They've hunted me my whole life, Daniel, but this time, they'll come for you too," she said, her voice almost lost under the roar of the descending ships. One of the warcraft landed hard in the sand, kicking up a storm of dust. Soldiers poured out, armored in black, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. They fanned out quickly, rifles raised. The commander stepped forward, his voice amplified through a helmet speaker. "Human, walk away, leave the asset, and you live." Daniel almost laughed at the word asset. He looked at Lyra, her shoulders squared, despite her exhaustion. Her gaze locked on the soldiers with the calm of someone who had faced death too many times to count. He thought of the market, the whisper in English, the moment he'd said, "I'll take her," and how everything had changed since he stepped in front of her, blaster drawn but lowered at his side. "She's not your asset," he said, and the commander's helmet tilted slightly, as if amused. "Then you die with her." The soldiers moved in, sand crunching under their boots. But before they could close the gap, Daniel raised his blaster not at them, but at the canyon wall above. One well-placed shot sent a cascade of rock and bone crashing down, dust swallowing everything in a roaring wave. In the chaos, he grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the ship. They sprinted through the swirling sand, the roar of engines behind them. Daniel didn't need to look to know the soldiers were coming. As the ship's hatch closed and the engines screamed to life, he glanced at Lyra, her face lit by the glow of the control panels. "We run for now," he said, "but next time, we choose where the fight happens." Lyra's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that didn't quite hide the weight in her eyes. "Then let's make sure it's somewhere they won't survive," she replied. The ship shot up into the burning sky, leaving the war fleet in a haze of dust. And for the first time, Daniel realized he wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous enough to change the fate of worlds, and there was no going back.